The next speaker we have with us today is Professor Siuli Jana. Professor Jana is a retired associate professor, Department of Economics, Lady Brabourne College. The title of her paper is Gender Inequality Impacting on Women's Participation in the Labour Market, the Case of the Domestic Workers. May I now please request Siuli to take over?
Okay. Thank you. I thank the organizers of the ICSSR-ERC sponsored International Interdisciplinary Workshop on Gender Sensitization for inviting me to give a lecture in this session of the workshop. I welcome all the participants of this session, and I expect that I would get enlightened by their valued responses to whatever I have to say. You all know my topic in this session is on gender inequality impacting on women's participation in the labor market, the case of the domestic workers. I begin now with a few words on gender inequality. Gender inequality is, as we all know, the inequality that a woman faces just because she is a woman. Such inequality can be observed in the developed countries, but it is acute in the countries of the third world, including, of course, India. Women in much of the world today are less well-nourished than men, less healthy, and more vulnerable to physical violence and sexual abuse. They are much less likely than men to be literate and still less likely to have professional or technical education. Gender inequality is strongly correlated with poverty. If a family has means to send one child to school, it will be the boy child who would be sent. The same is true about health care and nutritional attention. However, traditional social and familial conceptions regarding gendered positions also matter. Gender inequality deprives women of justice in every sphere of life, so much so that it is difficult to ensure quality of life or a good human life for them. They lack the necessary support for achieving such things in life. Unequal status often impedes their effective participation in political life. In many countries, women are not full equals under the law. They do not have the same property rights as men, the same rights to form associations, and not even the same rights to mobility and religious liberty. They are required to undertake full responsibility for household work and child care. For employed women, this means a double burden. Our objective here is to show how gender inequality shapes women's participation in the labor market. In this context, it is also necessary to explore how gender inequality can be reduced, because that influences such participation of women. Since gender is a social construction, it can be changed. Each society constructs particular roles for each sex, and gender describes such roles. Opportunities in human life depends on such gender roles, and gender inequality refers to gender-based differences in opportunities between males and females. To illustrate a central theme, we would focus on the case of the domestic workers. When women enter the workspace, they face gender discrimination. They do not get equal pay for work of equal value. They get lower paid, lower valued jobs. Women are also often sexually harassed at the workplace. Their work effort, talent, and contribution are underestimated. They are generally not promoted to top powerful professional positions because their leadership talent is undervalued. This happens in the organized sector. In India, 93% of the workers are in the unorganized or the informal sector. Women mostly work in this sector, hence they face added discrimination in the form of very low wages, lack of social security coverage, and almost no legal protection. We would explore how gender inequality shapes women's participation in this sector. The domestic workers, the majority of whom are women, belong to this sector. Throughout, we would refer to the Indian contexts. India is a country where we have the largest democracy of the world, where women have constitutionally guaranteed right to equality, but there is gross inequality in practice. Where there is equality in theory, but not in reality. The Indian situation with respect to gender inequality, therefore, is highly thought-provoking. But in this country, diversity is so broad-based that it is very difficult to generalize. We would present broad general views, keeping in mind that primary data-based area studies or case studies are extremely important for developing the relevant ideas. Globally, a substantial number of men work as domestic workers, but still, the domestic work sector is a highly feminized sector. About 83% of all domestic workers worldwide are women. This is the data that pertain to 2010. In India, in the pre-independence period and also in the early years after independence, large proportions of the domestic workers were male, but over the years, particularly in the first 2 decades of the 21st century, post-globalization, a clear trend towards feminization has taken place. Globalization and economic reform of the early 1990s went in favor of capital and skilled labor. Women, particularly unskilled women, lost jobs. They, as a survival strategy, entered the domestic work sector, which requires very low skill. In this sector, men perform the better paying tasks of the gardeners, the drivers, and the security guards, while all other lower paid household work and care are done by women. Gender inequality is strikingly present in the workspace of the domestic workers. The domestic workers, the majority of whom are women, are often the lifeline to the members of the households where they work. They take care of the households in all possible ways, thus enabling the female household members to take up productive jobs outside. Thus, they play a crucial role in keeping the markets and the economies working, and at the same time help in reducing inequality between the educationally qualified male and female members of the households. But they themselves are subject to gross inequalities as they get very low wages, enjoy very little social security benefits, and almost no legal coverage compared to other workers, largely the male workers in the economy. This is strongly evident in countries like India, where the informality of the domestic work sector is very high. Unfortunately, the domestic workers have so far not received the required attention from the state, the people of the country, as well as from the media. One may recall the situation during the pandemic of 2020 and its rerun in 2021. The media brought to focus the grave situation that the migrant workers, particularly the male migrant workers, faced during the pandemic, but not a word was said about the domestic workers, the majority of whom are women. Gender inequality is inherently involved in this kind of varied attention. The relative invisibility of the domestic workforce may also be responsible for this. So it's high time that they are made more visible through parliamentary debates, public discussions, as well as through seminars and academic discourses. The domestic workers should not be constituted as domestic helps, though they are so called in informal discussions. The word helps expresses a social transaction, whereas in reality, domestic work involves an economic transaction. In formal discussions, they should be referred to as domestic workers, even if they do not technically have the status of real workers. The domestic workers should not be construed as domestic helps, though they are so called in informal discussions. The word help expresses a social transaction, whereas in reality, domestic work involves an economic transaction. In formal discussions, they should be referred to as domestic workers, even if they do not technically have the status of real workers like other workers in the country. Convention number 189 of the International Labour Organization, adopted to promote decent work for the domestic workers, gives internationally acceptable standard definitions of domestic work and of the domestic workers. Domestic work means work performed in and for a household, and domestic worker means any person engaged in domestic work under an employment relationship. A person who performs domestic work only sporadically and not on an occupational basis is not a domestic worker. But to understand clearly who a domestic worker is, it is important to consider their common and distinctive characteristics. We should know their different types, the varied tasks they perform, the employer-employee relationships, and also the different ways in which they are paid. They may be full-time, part-time, live-in, live-out, migrant, and non-migrant. They may do cleaning, cooking, caring, etc., and they may be paid in cash or in kind, and may often be given zero-interest loans, which are very important for them. The position of women in the labor market is characterized by their overrepresentation in low-paid jobs in sectors where women usually work. Domestic work is one of the lowest-paying jobs in the labor market. In countries where minimum wages have been set, there are compliance gaps. Some countries have set minimum wages, but only partially. This means, in spite of efforts to set the minimum, wages tend to be low. Wages in this sector are low because of low skill, low educational level, high incidence of informality, lack of collective representation, weak individual bargaining power, vulnerable social status, and most importantly, because of undervaluation of household work. Low skill and low education are the outcomes of gender inequality entrenched since childhood. The practice of paying in kind allowances and providing food and accommodation if required also exert a downward pressure on wages. It should be noted that even if such provisions are important, money wages are what actually benefit them and their families. Work means contribution to the production of goods and services. The domestic workers provide a kind of services, do productive work, and are paid for it, though the wages are very low. Their contribution to the production of services is included in national income. Still, they are not considered as real workers under the labor laws. The innumerable number of housewives do unpaid household work and keep the families functioning, but neither is their work considered as work, nor they as workers. The absence of objective valuation and the presence of subjective undervaluation of household work are responsible for such outcomes that foster gender inequality in this sector. Hence, valuation and adequate valuation are important steps towards addressing gender inequality in this women-dominated part of the labor market. Only if such valuations become a reality and unpaid household work is considered as work, it would become mandatory for everyone to respect household work. The domestic workers can then voice their demands for better wages and for the real worker status. With unpaid household work being considered as work, the workforce participation rate would also significantly go up. The issue of valuation of unpaid household work has long been neglected on the ground that it is difficult to value a homemaker's services because of an inadequate price system. There are difficulties in assigning a monetary value to household work. The neglect has also been because of the fact that household work mirrors work that has traditionally been carried out by women in their own homes. It is work that has been internalized as natural by the women themselves, so much so that the question of valuation did not arise. In India, the Motor Vehicles Act 1988 first made some efforts to assess the unpaid contribution of women in the households. In determining the compensation payable in case of death under this act, the monetary value of the services rendered by the housewives requires to be considered. In matrimonial property disputes in cases of divorce, valuation of household work is again important. The courts have thus been involved in valuing household services. Of the various methods followed by the courts in India, the more acceptable ones are the opportunity cost method and the replacement cost method. According to the first method, valuation done on the basis of wages foregone by not entering the job market. According to the second method, valuation has to be done on the basis of wages earned by a professional for doing the same work in the market, or on the basis of wages needed to hire a household worker. These methods, however, are not foolproof, but the judicial developments are still important as they are likely to change the mindset regarding household work and provide social recognition to it. A scientific method of monetarily valuing such work is likely to develop in the near future. In India, a staggering 49% of women from the 1.3 billion strong nation do unpaid domestic work, but their contribution to GDP is not counted just because of the problem of objectively valuing such work. Till now, the valuation of unpaid household work is an unsettled issue, but the awareness has grown about the need to value it, and that has opened up possibilities of further deliberations on it. Excuse me. But valuation is one thing and adequate valuation is another thing. Household work is undervalued. In the presence of such undervaluation, minimum wages, which promises to be a very important tool for promoting gender equality in the labor market, are hard to achieve, and the domestic workers fail to get at least the minimum wages at par with the other workers in the economy. The question is, what accounts for this undervaluation? Gender inequality present in the family structure, accepted as natural or appropriate, even by the women themselves, is one important reason. The striking inequality in the sharing of household responsibilities, also taken as natural by the women, is another factor. Because of the interplay of such factors, household work commands little respect and recognition, so that undervaluation of household work turns out to be quite natural. A reduction in gender inequality in the social and the familial arrangements, along with their underlying conceptual structures, is the only way that can lead to an upward valuation of women's household work. This unpaid valuation, given that the monetary valuation has been ensured, would mean over time better wages for the domestic workers, a real worker status for them, worker status for the housewives, and a significant reduction in the gender inequality in the labor market. The female workforce participation rate would also go up. Unpaid household work by itself is a big issue, both globally and in India. In India, the System of National Accounts 1993, on the basis of which gross domestic product is estimated, includes production of paid domestic services, but excludes production of domestic and personal services carried out by the members of the households for their own personal consumption. National income is therefore lower than what it should have been had all household work been included in its estimation. Just imagine 700 million people of India, more than twice the population of the United States, who perform unpaid household duties are not recorded in national income. The omission of unpaid household work from the conception of work provides the missing link that influences the existence of large gender gaps in labor force participation rates. More men are found to work than women. No doubt, all this is linked again to the valuation problem. Unequal sharing of household responsibilities between men and women again reflects gross gender inequality. Divisions in gender roles start early. Adolescent girls and young women do more unpaid work in their childhood than their male counterparts. Girls even drop out of school to assist their mothers in household work, while the boys do not drop out just because of this. It gets built into everybody's concept that household work is largely a female responsibility. In fact, it is the duty of the female members of the household to run the household. The women themselves internalize this idea and pass it on to the next generation. Women doing jobs outside undertake a double burden, paid work outside and unpaid work inside. The same is true about the domestic workers. The female work participation rate largely depends on the burden of unpaid household work that falls on the female members of the household. Wherein lies the solution is an important question. The educated women doing jobs outside can outsource household work by employing domestic helps and thus reduce their own burden. Promotion of shared responsibilities is a new line of option. Spread of education also helps, as there is a direct relationship between education and participation in the labor market. To promote shared responsibilities, there should first occur a total change in the mindset of the male family members. The domestic workers can help reduce the burden of the educated and employed women, but the double burden appears to be heavy for themselves. The question is how the domestic workers can reduce their own double burden. Would the concept of shared responsibility at all work in their households? In their households, there is almost no sharing of unpaid household work. Glaring gender inequality prevails. Will a rise in the level of education ease their burden? In India, the domestic workers are largely illiterate. These are big questions. Case studies are required to clarify these issues. There is lack of adequate and dependable data. One has to depend on household surveys, labor surveys, and legal information. Primary database studies are most welcome. In the absence of a worker status, The domestic workers get deprived of a minimum wage as enjoyed by the other workers in the society. There is no specific pay scale, no allowances, no pay hikes like workers in other sectors. Non-worker status leads to negligence also with respect to hours of work and protection from excuse me, occupational hazards. They are deprived of weekly off, annual leave, maternity leave, sick leave, insurance, and other social security benefits that other workers enjoy. If there is an accident at the workplace, the employer just lays off the worker, does not pay for the medical treatment of the worker. In most cases, of course, deprivation from maternity leave is of serious concern because the majority of the women domestic workers are in the childbearing age. Since the domestic work sector is dominated by women, all these point to gross gender inequality. The role of minimum wages and its compliance in reducing gender disparity is considered to be extremely important. To guarantee minimum wage coverage for the domestic workers, one should understand the remunerations prevailing in the domestic work sector, gaps in minimum wage coverage, and the extent of minimum wage violations. Comprehensive and innovative approaches are required to ensure respect for minimum wage legislations so that compliance can be achieved. In view of adequate and dependable data, we have already said empirical future research will have to depend on household surveys, labor surveys, and legal information. Empirical cross-country analysis of the role of minimum wages in the labor market would be immensely valuable. The reference frame may consist of a diverse group of developing countries. The lessons learned from addressing gender inequality in the domestic work sector may be useful in addressing any gender-based inequality present in other female-dominated sectors such as agriculture and home-based work. Apart from low wages, informality and lack of women's empowerment are also important aspects of gender disparity in the labor market. Ensuring minimum wages and its compliance, formalization of the domestic work sector, and promotion of women's empowerment are therefore the future lines of action. We have so far tried to illustrate labor market inequality along gender lines, focusing on the case of the domestic workers. Considering that gender inequality in the labor market is a reflection of gender inequality in the society at large, we would like to detour a little to confront an important question. The question is, how can gender inequality in the society at large be reduced so that a deterring effect falls on the gender equality in the labor market? In this context, it would be immensely useful to consider Professor Amurtha Sen's analysis of gender inequality and the theories of justice for women, along with his capabilities approach to tackle the concerned issues. Professor Namartha Nussbaum's alternative capabilities approach is also worth examining. We would now briefly discuss the ideas of Professor Sen in relation to gender inequality and justice for women. In families, inequality between men and women is often accepted as natural and legitimate. Such inequality, in fact, survives because the society thinks it is just, and more importantly, because those who have most to lose from such inequality, that is the women, accept it without any objection. Sen gives the idea of cooperative conflicts, which he says can be resolved by his famous capabilities approach. In a particular social arrangement, all the parties involved have something to gain but the different parties may gain differently in one arrangement than in another. Thus, there is cooperation, but also conflicts, which may be called cooperative conflicts. One way to eliminate such conflicts is to assume that there is an altruistic head of the family who acts in the joint interest of all in the family, and others in the family follow him. This means that all would want to maximize the joint interest so that in effect there would not arise any conflict of interests. If, for example, women die in much larger numbers than men because of differential health care and medical attention, then it is assumed that all in the family, including the women, rationally promote such an arrangement and accept the consequences. Without any objection. This kind of an attitude gives stability to extreme gender inequalities in the traditional system, which, however, remains invisible. On the other hand, it is quite natural that individualistic perceptions of interest may prevail, leading to divergent interests of different family members, leading to conflicts. In such situations, gender inequality becomes visible. The capabilities approach can handle such conflicts and deal with gender inequalities in an appropriate way, given the society rejects the view that a change in the traditional conception of women's role would turn out to be inefficient. In Shen's view, it can handle such conflicts better than Rawlsian liberalism and economic utilitarianism. On efficiency ground, utilitarianism concentrates on the generation of the maximum sum total of utilities without considering how unequally the sum total may get distributed. If women adapt their desires and preferences to existing inequalities, thinking that to do so is legitimate, only generation of utilities would not mean equity and justice for women, as inequalities, freedoms, and achievements would remain concealed. Shen argues that to ensure justice, what is required is equality in the distribution of advantages. Rawls focuses on primary goods, goods such as income and wealth, basic liberties, freedom of movement, etc., that every rational person is supposed to want, as providing the basis for assessing individual advantages. But Shen points out that holdings of primary goods cannot simply be taken as the basis for judging individual advantages, because primary goods are the means to freedoms we want to achieve and not the indicators of freedoms themselves. The problem arises from the fact that the transformation possibilities of means into actual freedoms are not the same for all human beings. Herein lies the issue of gender inequality. With the same income and means to buy food and medicines, a pregnant woman may not be able to achieve the same level of nutritional well-being like a man of the same age and with the same means. In this case, there is a biological factor but that influences the women's ability, but it is not the only factor. Her inability is also caused by her sex. There are again other inter-individual differences along gender lines, often accepted as natural by the women themselves. Thus, gender inequalities can account for a situation where equal holdings of primary goods can go with very unequal freedoms with respect to what people can and cannot do with their lives. Women may have their own perceptions about what is legitimate and that may impose constraints on their behavior, and such constraints may affect the relationship between primary goods and the freedoms that can be generated by their use. Women may get restrained from using the primary goods within their command for generating appropriate capabilities. Only having primary goods at one's disposal does not therefore tell the whole story. The presence of gender inequalities play a considerably important role. According to Sen's capability approach, individual advantages should be judged in terms of freedoms to achieve rather than in terms of holdings of primary goods. This approach emphasizes on expressing individual According to Sen's capability approach, individual advantages should be judged in terms of freedoms to achieve rather than in terms of holdings of primary goods. The approach emphasizes on expressing individual achievements in life in terms of beings and doings, such as being adequately nourished to playing a part in the life of the community. Individuals differ greatly in their capabilities to function, that is, to convert the same resources into beings and doings. A human being may be capable of doing something, but actually is not doing. That means he or she is not functioning. This is what Sen meant by capability functioning. Sen's approach insists on the significance of the capabilities of the individuals to achieve the kinds of lives they value. Accordingly, importance should be given to overall generation of capabilities and also to reducing inequalities in its distribution. In reducing inequalities in capabilities, one should not get obsessed by the idea that inefficiency would arise. If this reduction is achieved, irrespective of gender inequality would prevail, would fall, and there would be an impact on women's participation in the labor market. Further research would corroborate the statement on the impact on the labor market. The capabilities approach has become an important new paradigm. It has made a look beyond development to issues like gender justice possible. Another alternative capability approach, that of Professor Martha Nussbaum, would also be worth considering in this context. She has provided the most influential version of a capability theory of justice derived from the requirements of human dignity, a list of central capabilities that should get incorporated into national constitutions and guaranteed to all up to a certain standard. Martha Nussbaum is concerned with the predicaments of the poor women of India. She has studied cases of poor women of India, has delved deep into their lives, and has impeccably narrated the gender discrimination these women have faced. Her narration, I think, is a must-read for all interested in gender inequality issues. In her view, thoughts about justice should shape the struggles of such poor women. She shows how philosophy can influence the basic constitutional principles that should be respected and implemented by all governments. To what extent the constitutional principles are implemented by the governments can be taken as a comparative measure of quality of life across the nations. Her study, like Professor Sen, is based on the idea of human capabilities, that is, what people are actually capable of doing or becoming in the real world. in all the ways in which women have to suffer from discrimination just because of sex, they end up with unequal social and political circumstances that give them unequal human capabilities. An extremely important point that NASBOM emphasizes is that the capabilities should be ensured for each and every person, not for a group, for each and every person, treating each as an end and not as a mere tool of the ends of others. NASBOM gives a list of central human capabilities. Women often consider themselves as the ends of others rather than as ends in their own right. The principle of respecting capability right for each and every person is bound to act as a force in the lives of such women. Her approach also uses the idea of a threshold level of each capability beneath which its truly human functioning is not available to the citizens. The goal should be to achieve capability above this threshold level. How the capabilities approach can be made operative in the case of the domestic workers so that these workers with a very inferior status can acquire capabilities to improve their lives is an extremely important question. Domestic workers' movement should gain strength, but experience shows that though the domestic workers' movement is growing in strength, even in the developing countries, collective bargaining for improving wages is still an exception. High illiteracy, striking informality, lack of policy intervention all matters. There is still an absence of public policy focus on the domestic workers. Labor law coverage for the domestic workers has historically been weak. Minimum wage legislation for the domestic workers is lacking even in countries where there are such legislations for the other workers. Non-compliance of minimum wage legislation is not a strict function of the level of minimum wages set. It is not because a high level has been set that they are not complied with. Social attitudes, perception of the value of work, discrimination, are more important other factors. After almost a total neglect for more than a century, the academicians have taken an interest in the analysis of the domestic work sector. The ILO Convention 189 has provided international standards for decent work conditions for the domestic workers. But still, a gross gender inequality prevails in this sector, both globally and in India. India has not yet ratified the convention, and therefore its provisions are not binding on her. A comprehensive law for the domestic workers is still pending. Minimum wage laws have been passed, but only in a few states. Wages are low principally because of undervaluation of unpaid domestic labor, which still persists. Informality is very high in the domestic work sector. Having not been given a worker status, these workers are unable to get social security benefits. They face inequality in many forms. They do unpaid household work in their own homes and thus share a disproportionately heavier burden of unpaid domestic work. They face domestic violence, do not have supportive atmosphere at home, bear almost the full financial responsibility of running their own homes because in most cases, their alcohol-addicted husbands use their own wages for alcohol consumption. In many cases, these women are either widowed or separated and so has to bear the full financial responsibility of their own households. Their low education and low skill are also outcomes of gender inequality. Subsequent research based on case studies is significantly important to bring to focus all these issues. We now focus on women's labor force participation rate, which are varied across the world in India, it is considerably low. India has developed on many fronts, but is still far behind in the field of gender inequality. Far behind in the field of gender equality. The situation with respect to female LFPR, labor force participation rate, has worsened due to COVID-19 pandemic. By females, we here mean women of 15 years or older working or looking for a job. And labor force participation rate is defined as the percentage of persons in the labor force that is working or seeking or available for work in the population. It is said that if the participation rate for women equals to that of men in India, the GDP of India would increase by 60% in 2025. There are many reasons behind the low female labor force participation rate. According to some analysts, there is lack of consciousness regarding gender balance in the business strategy followed in this country. There is rather a bias towards hiring men on grounds of greater commitment. If we look deeper into the lives of women in the country, one principal reason would turn out to be the disproportionately shared heavy burden of household work. In this context, the role of the domestic workers needs to be considered. The domestic workers can play a double role in increasing the workforce participation rate. When household work gets outsourced, by employing them, the educated female members of the families can participate in the labor market. Then if the work of the domestic workers gets respected and they get recognized as real workers, then the participation rate again increases. A reduction in gender equality happens, and this has a positive impact on women's participation in the labor market. Formalization of the domestic work sector and women's empowerment are other future lines of action that would interact with each other to enforce a higher female labor force participation rate. It is true that women face gender discrimination in the organized sector labor market, but surely not as intense as what the women domestic workers face in the unorganized or the informal sector labor market. Formalization of the large domestic work sector is an extremely important upcoming issue. Formalization means a gradual transformation of the informal sector to a formal sector. Without formal employment, access to decent work as envisaged for the domestic workers by the ILO would remain elusive. The first step would be legal recognition of the domestic workers as workers under the labor and social security laws. The next step would be to enforce implementation. Alongside the non-migrant domestic workers, it is also necessary that workspace of the migrant domestic workers get formalized. These are no doubt very big issues, not easy to resolve. For a developing country like India, it is a long way to go. It is something to be achieved in the future to improve women's participation in the labor market. But most important of all is to reduce gender inequalities in the society at large through increase in the capabilities of all, irrespective of gender. The poor and disadvantaged women, like the domestic workers, should particularly acquire capabilities to improve their well-being. Following NASBOM, we would like to add that there should be an ethical basis behind development planning and public policy. The concept of human capabilities, explaining what people are actually capable of doing or becoming in the real world, should provide the basis for fundamental political principles. Political and economic thought must be sensitive to gender difference as a factor posing obstacles in the way of ensuring justice for women. There is a basic minimum that all governments should provide for its citizens. Thus, this basic minimum is what respect for human dignity requires. Thank you.
Thank you so much, madam, for such an intriguing speech. Participants, if you have any question, you can put the questions in the chat box, please.
I have a question. Can I just say it?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, you can say.
Ma'am, thank you for the lecture. Actually, what I was wondering that even though if the female domestic workers, even if all these issues are resolved, like the maternity leave and proper wages and all, but still the question of who will take care of their household chores still remains. Like in case of women who are educated and working, they can outsource their work to the domestic help. But in that case, even if domestic help are provided with all the facilities, but the question of the household work in their case still remains. So what is your opinion on that?
Yes, that remains, of course. That is a problem. Who will take the burden of their households? So if this is a question to come up, how to improve their household burden, how to reduce their household burden. They can think of some modern ways of looking at their households. They run very primitive kitchen and all that. They can improve that. They can have gas stoves and all that, modern facilities. If they get proper wages, their wages are high, they can think of modern facilities, isn't it? Modern equipments, to some extent at least, a modern kitchen and all that, to ease their burden. I think that is the way. Otherwise, who is to share? It's the question of promotion of shared responsibility, I don't think is going to happen in their households. In many cases, as I see around, that they run their own households alone.
Right.
It's a problem. They can think in that ways to improve their household facilities rather. And if they get proper wages, proper and good wages, then they can work in fewer homes. That is also my view, that they cannot have to run from homes to homes. That takes a lot of time and energy. They can work in fewer homes. They will go back home early and manage their households. That is also a point. And these will get revealed if case studies are very important for them. Just generalizations will not help us. Case studies are very important, isn't it?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Welcome.
Dear participants, if you have any other question, you may ask, ma'am. Okay, so it seems that you have quite clarified your point, ma'am. So there are no more questions. Thank you, madam, for your speech. And we will like to see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, madam. So with your permission, ma'am, we are moving on to our next segment.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.